Good evening, everyone. I'm Michelle Storms. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Executive Director at the ACLU of Washington. This is Native American Heritage Month, and it's also the Thanksgiving week. This month, and during this week in particular, we remember and center the first people. They are still here, and justice is still overdue. I am speaking to you from the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Coast Salish people, who have stewarded this land for generations. Our office downtown sits on the unceded territory of the Duwamish people. We honor them by remembering the role our country played in the stripping of their land, culture, and language, and recognizing there is much more work we all need to do to make this country fair for Indigenous people and for all people. Tonight's Flights and Rights dives more deeply into America's historical and continued unfair treatment of Indigenous people and the critical march towards freedom and fairness. Last month, we sponsored KEXP's day-long programming honoring Indigenous Peoples Day with DJ Gabriel Teodros. KEXP is an important partner of ours for Flights and Rights. Our Flights and Rights events are typically hosted in breweries and event spaces around the state, most often at the gathering space of KEXP 90.3 FM in Seattle or KEXP.org everywhere else in the world. KEXP's Gabriel Teodros has partnered with us again by creating a playlist especially for this week. Please check the chat box for details and you can listen to it after this program. And folks, actually, that's not all. We're partnering with a couple Indigenous-owned places this week. Those of you in Seattle, you can visit Off the Res Cafe at the Burke Museum on the UW campus tomorrow, Wednesday, or December 2nd through December 4th, and grab yourself a meal for $5 off by mentioning the ACLU. We're also partnering with Talking Cedar, the Chehalis Tribes Brewery, and the United States' first tribal-owned distillery. Talking Cedar is the first distillery allowed in Indian country since 1834, thanks to the repeal of an Andrew Jackson-era statute that prohibited such operations. The Chehalis Indian Tribe and Heritage Distillery successfully lobbied Congress in 2018, so many years later, to repeal that ban on distilleries in Indian country. Talking Cedar is in Rochester Grand Mound. You should visit there too and mention the ACLU for $5 off. Check out our website for more details on these partnerships and learn more about these and other Indigenous-owned organizations to put money back into Indigenous communities and to support Indigenous people. Everyone in attendance tonight has been entered into an ACLU of Washington Supreme swag giveaway. For the first time, the prize package includes KEXP and ACLU koozies. You cannot get these anywhere else. We'll draw names after the event and notify 3 lucky winners by email tomorrow. Okay, so now to introduce tonight's program. There is a lot going on right now, and it's too much between the growing pandemic that's stopping us from gathering in person and the current administration continuing to make brazen attempts to undermine our democracy. Before the election, the ACLU was involved in numerous lawsuits all over the country in support of our voting rights, addressing eligibility to vote by mail, eliminating witness signature requirements for voting by mail, and dealing with all kinds of other unnecessary barriers to voting, trying to get drop boxes and satellite offices up to accept mail-in absentee ballots and other issues, right? We were involved in lawsuits in 16 states in Puerto Rico to help voting be accessible. Voting should be easy and accessible and safe and not difficult. And I want to assure you that with all of that, we continue to actively monitor all attempts to disenfranchise voters, and we will intervene when and where necessary to ensure that every vote counts. And we won't stop fighting until we, the people, means every single one of us, and together we will prevail. So let's pause and take a breath this evening. Let's be together in gratitude for the great work that happens in spite of these strange and momentous challenges. I know I'm grateful to spend this evening in conversation with some incredible people this evening. We'll be talking about cultural connections needed for Indigenous youth to thrive, creative solutions to overcome the particular barriers Indigenous youth encounter. Our speakers have a lot to share, so let's dive in. First, we'll hear from Crystal Pardue. Crystal is an Equal Justice Works Fellow with the ACLU of Washington. Her primary passion is advocating for Native American students facing disproportionately high levels of discipline and policing in Washington public schools. Crystal believes in a community-first approach to lawyering and seeks to uplift Native voices, ideas, and culture throughout legal and political systems. Crystal attended the University of Washington School of Law, where she focused her studies on civil rights and tribal governance. As a Native woman of color from Chumash in California, she identifies with the community she serves and deeply understands the unique issues affecting Native people today. Next, we'll hear from Sarah Sintz-Wilson. Sarah Sintz-Wilson from the Oglala Nation serves as the elected chair for the Urban Native Education Alliance. Sarah is committed to strengthening our urban Native community through tireless advocacy, organizing, and networking, both within the Native community and the greater King County area. Sarah's educational background includes a BA in political science from UW, a chemical dependency license, and an MA degree in applied psychology from Antioch University. Sarah is a Washington State licensed mental health counselor and a certified problem gambling counselor. She has worked in the chemical dependency field for over 17 years, specializing in both family and couples counseling. Sarah is currently employed with a local tribe as a problem gambling coordinator. Sarah and her partner Mark have one daughter who's now enrolled in Graduate School of Public Health at University of North Dakota, and Sarah's most important role is as grandmother to grandson Waylon. Last but not least, Victoria Plumage will speak. Victoria comes from the Nakota Nation from the Fort Belknap Indian community. They began their career in Native education during high school as a peer tutor. They attended the University of Washington and received their BA in American Indian Studies. While a student, Victoria was an active member of First Nations at UW and Yahali. Both programs are dedicated to helping Native students navigate campus life and academic institutions. They organized events such as the First Nations at UW Spring Powwow and Yahali Native Youth Conference. Their off-campus service learning sites included the Huchusada After School Program, the Seattle Indian Health Board, and Big Island Invasive Species Committee. Victoria's 10+ years of community involvement and organizing focuses on sharing stories and knowledge to connect education, health, and culture with an aim to strengthen the network of local organizations serving American Indian and Alaska Native people in the greater Seattle area. Victoria contracts with local organizations to design program activities, curriculum, and facilitate workshops. They currently live on occupied Coast Salish territory. All right. This is an amazing group of people that I'm so proud to present to you. Let's get started with Crystal.
Thank you, Michelle. Haku tikali lahupushershets Samsonit Crystal Wuya. Hello, all. I hope you're all doing well. My name is Crystal Pardue, and I come from the Chumash tribe, the original inhabitants of a coastal stretch of Southern California. Centering the conversation tonight, we need to stay in the present, but we also need to be operating with an awareness that the present is informed by the past and influenced by the past. So with that in mind, I'd like to start the conversation by talking about something called generational trauma. Then I'd like to situate us grounded in the reality of the historical and continued treatment of Indigenous youth in the United States. Then, importantly, I'd like to share some stories that demonstrate just how resilient and courageous today's Indigenous youth truly are. So starting with generational trauma, I'm sure many of tonight's attendees are aware that Indigenous people occupied and were stewards of the land that we now call the United States since time immemorial. European settlers drove people from their land and homes, forbid them from speaking their languages and practicing their cultural values and religions, and diseases like smallpox and tuberculosis were introduced and spread rapidly and dangerously through the populations. So according to Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, historical trauma can be defined as the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over one's lifetime and from generation to generation following loss of lives, land, and vital aspects of culture. The concept of historical trauma describes how the effects of collective injuries, such as genocide and discrimination, can linger for generations. Another definition is that it's the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding from massive group trauma across generations, including lifespan. So there have been multiple psychological studies that show that even if you weren't the original experiencer, so to speak, of the various ways of attempted genocide that settler colonialism brought, you can still be overwhelmed with the grief and the loss and the post-traumatic stress symptoms associated with those events. Not to mention the current and real loss of culture, traditional language, and family knowledge that affects so many Indigenous people here in the United States today. So I'd mentioned briefly just a couple moments ago some of the many ways that settler colonialism tried to eradicate Indigenous populations, but one particularly traumatic way that impacted Indigenous youth primarily, but all Indigenous people because of the rippling effects, was through boarding schools and through mission schools. In the mid 1800s, the overwhelming societal view of Native American people was that we were, somehow less than. We were different, or we were wild, or some other terms like that. We were needing different religions, and we were needing to assimilate to the dominant culture that had been introduced to the United States. So beginning in 1869, and with partnership of several denominations of Christian Catholic churches, the United States adopted an Indian boarding school policy, which was expressly intended to implement cultural genocide through the removal and really the reprogramming of Native American children. Well, that was the attempt. It did not succeed. Clearly, we are here, we are resilient, we are courageous, we still have our cultures and practices. But this was the attempt to accomplish, again, the systematic destruction of Native cultures and communities. The stated purpose, the stated, in pen and paper purpose of the policy was to, quote, kill the Indian and save the man. That was the intent of these boarding schools, was to assimilate children, Native American children, to, again, the dominant settler culture. So between the 1869 and all the way through the 1960s, it's likely that hundreds of thousands Native American children were removed from their homes and families and placed in these boarding schools operated by the federal government and churches. Native children that were voluntarily or most often forcibly removed from their homes, families, and communities during this time were taken to schools far away, where they were punished for speaking their native language, banned from acting in any way that might be seen to represent traditional or cultural practices. They were stripped of their traditional clothing, their hair, their personal belongings, and behaviors reflective of their cultures. They also experienced rampant physical, cultural, spiritual abuse, neglect, and experienced treatment that in many cases constituted torture for even something like speaking their language. Many children never returned home, and their fates have not yet even been accounted for by the US government. For Colonel Richard Henry Pratt, who was one of the biggest names in the boarding school area, his goal was complete assimilation. So in 1879, he established one of the most well-known off-reservation boarding schools called Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So around the same time, Spanish missions along the Pacific coast were attempting to assimilate Native people through similar methods. In these missions, Native people were forced to work on behalf of the church. They were forced to speak Spanish. They were forced to give up their traditional practices. The children here, the Indigenous youth here, were forced to separate from their families and go up through the school system and leave behind their traditional practices and beliefs. And later the United States formalized, and multiple states formalized, these assimilatory practices by enacting bans on all Native American religions and culturally significant practices. And these bans weren't formally undone until 1978, but in practice, there are still effects of these bans experienced today and impacting Native people today. So I think about this historical treatment. I think about the boarding school era, the mission schools, in this treatment of Native children during my current work almost daily. I think about it all the time. As you know, I said before, the past informs and influences the present. And we know that generational trauma means that the traumatic treatment and the torture treatment of Indigenous youth that are our ancestors can have effects on us today, in addition to the current traumatic practices that Indigenous youth are experiencing in public schools. So culturally uninformed school discipline proceedings in particular disproportionately affect Native American students in Washington state public schools. Compared to their peers, Native students are specifically 30%, at least 30% more likely, depending on the district, more likely to experience long-term school discipline and referrals to the juvenile court criminal legal system. They're twice as likely to be forced to repeat a grade, and they're 3 times as likely to drop out of school. Native students, because of racism in the classroom, because of disproportionately high rates of discipline and culturally uninformed teaching, Native students often lack they frequently describe their school experiences as ones that don't encourage individual expression of culture, that don't affirm cultural aspects of identity and being, and don't teach Indigenous history in a way that fosters pride. Native students also often lack legal advocacy during discipline hearings, which can lead to devastating long-term effects on their access to education. Washington has made some great progress in the realm of Native youth in public schools. For example, the Washington legislators did pass in 2015 the Since Time Immemorial Act, which is not without faults, but it nevertheless does require tribally developed curriculum to be taught in all schools. That's tribally developed as from federally recognized tribes, so that is one limitation. But the use of the Since Time Immemorial curriculum has been endorsed by all 29 federally recognized tribes here in Washington. However, it is with limitations, and implementation and training have not been perfect nor adequately funded. And then in 2020, the Washington legislature passed a law that allows Native American students statewide to wear tribal regalia during their graduations. And this is such an important way that today's students can honor their ancestors, many of whom were likely subjected to the cultural eradication efforts when they themselves were students in boarding schools and mission schools. So I'd like to now share, with their permission and with names and certain identifiers changed, the stories and experience of 2 Native youth here in Washington. The first is from Laura, who is a Native Two-Spirit young person living in Eastern Washington. When they were in 7th grade, they were bullied for being open about their Two-Spirit identity. And they told me, when I told my teacher, she didn't even know what Two-Spirit was. She told me that there are so many new ways people identify that I shouldn't expect my classmates to understand and keep up. But my mom told me that we have many Two-Spirit ancestors. So Two-Spirit has been around for a really long time. Esther, a Native American young person living in Western Washington and attends public school, she told me, I was learning about Washington Native people in my class, and another student asked, aren't Native Americans extinct or something? And my teacher laughed. He said no, but he didn't do much else, and everyone else laughed too. It was embarrassing. So these 2 stories from these brave young people in Washington illustrate what it can be like to go through school as a Native person in an environment that doesn't affirm your identity, that doesn't encourage full cultural expression, and for you to show up to be 100% the person you are in school. However, every single time I want to talk about the various ways of oppression that are impacting Native people, I always want to talk about the strength, the resilience, the courage, the bravery of Native people too. And that is true as much as it can be in all ways for Laura and Esther. For example, Laura, who is the Two-Spirit young person in Eastern Washington, they organized an event entirely themselves for Two-Spirit visibility in their community. And they increased awareness, understanding of Two-Spirit. They fostered through courage and bravery and through resilience the environment that they should have received in the first place, but they demanded it themselves. Esther, similarly, she showed such courage and bravery, resilience. She testified before her school board. She spoke up in class. She advocated on behalf of herself and behalf of her peers, who, for all students really, who should receive an accurate teaching of Indigenous history in schools, because all students benefit from that. But she too, similarly, advocated for herself, and was an incredible showing of resiliency and bravery. So, just looking back, generational trauma is a thing. Boarding schools and the historical treatment of Indigenous youth inform and influence the way that Indigenous youth exists today. And unfortunately, the many different ways in which Indigenous youth are treated for showing up in schools today is a very, very similar attempt of cultural eradication that was present in history. So thank you, Michelle. Let's turn it over to, I believe, Victoria. Sarah, my bad, I'm so sorry.
It's all good, thank you. And I really appreciate everything you just said. And I was doing a lot of head nodding because so much of you summarized everything really, really well. So thank you so much, Crystal. And I want to thank the ACLU for the invitation to be here. I really admire the work that you all do, and I really appreciate it. So thank you. I'd like to start with sharing more about UNEA. And as a starting point, just to give some background, and then dive a little bit into some of the advocacy work that we do, and share about some of these interlocking systems of oppression that are negatively impacting our kids during COVID. And this is something that is just, obviously, it's very relevant and happening right now. So UNEA is a 501c3 Native-led, volunteer-based, grassroots, youth-centered organization grounded in cultural values and principles of integrity, interconnectedness, service, and inclusion. So we have one part-time staff, and I think people will appreciate that once I get into the scope of and the depth of reach and work that we're doing. Just keeping that in mind. UNEA is the largest and the longest running community-based organization supporting Indian education in Seattle. And our successful programs provide students with holistic and multifaceted network of culture-based resources, mentoring, tutoring, and culturally relevant learning. Our vast contributions towards improving Native student success and Indian education in the Seattle Public Schools, but also just in the entire Seattle region, spans over 12 years. And UNEA has a 100% graduation rate for students that are actively engaged in our Clear Sky program. So I wanted to share some of the work that we have done and that we're doing right now in response to COVID. So a lot of the work, the pillars of Clear Sky are leadership, life skills, literacy, and language. And we emphasize that, in addition, within the context of supporting students to be successful in their school. And we serve students, again, across the region. So we have students from private school, we have students out of district, and that is really important to us because we believe that, together we're stronger when we're all working together and not creating boundaries and limitations and restrictions. And those of you who know our tribal community, especially in Seattle, it's very fluid anyways. A student might be enrolled in private school, you know, this year and next year or next month, they're, you know, attending a school, a Seattle public school. So that that in itself is responsive to our community. So right now, well, some of the leadership work that we've done and the stewardship, people can look this up and it's pretty cool. Our students were involved in a collaborative effort to establish the Licton Springs as a sacred site in Seattle. And the Licton Springs Park, as it sits now, is embedded in a pretty high density area. And there's been lots of development happening in the area. And so Matt Remley and Tom Spear and a number of other people had already initiated the process through the city of Seattle. And it kind of fell dead in that work. And years later, Matt came back and said, hey, you know, is this something the students would want to do? And I saw that as just a perfect opportunity. And the students all agreed and they were excited about learning about sacred sites. It wasn't just about the park, you know, or Licton Springs. It was bigger. It was about exploring what it means, you know, to the land and our connection to the land, and looking at the importance of responsibility and cultural values and community and our, you know, taking initiative. None of those kids, you know, belong to any of the local tribes that were part of this. We had a part-time staff who's a young adult who is Tulalip and actually is related to Dr. Zakus, who is a noted healer that used the medicine, the red ochre medicine of Licton Springs to heal. So it was really an exciting project, and it was an extensive project. I think it was about an 8-month. And, you know, working with youth, that's kind of a hard thing to keep their attention for 8 months, you know, on a very, so we did a lot of work, like we did resolution writing. So that civic service and learning just that process of how to formulate, create, and then present it. They presented it to UNEA and we, you know, we approved it, or we voted to support it. They learned how to run a social media campaign, and they did a petition. They co-authored a petition. They did testimony. They did a lot of work. It was pretty exciting, and they actually learned they learned the nuts and bolts of how to do a presentation at a conference. So we hosted a conference, and they actually led 3 different presentations, you know, to their peers on how, you know, the sacredness of the land, what they learned. They also talked about other throughout Indian country, you know, different sacred sites and the importance of protecting those sites and how they've been commandeered and they're tourist places, and now, you know, and we don't have access to those places. And so the advocacy work that our students learned and the leadership was really beautiful to see. And you know, we just did another tour. We were asked by Blanchette High School, which is one of our, you could say it's like our sister school. We're working with them to create a little bit more cultural diversity and inclusivity and address their moniker, the Blanchette Braves. I don't know if you guys have heard of them. So our students were forming these good coalitions, you know, that are not adversarial, but are cooperative and collaborative, and just taking that approach. I know I'm jumping around a little bit because I get excited. I didn't have a whole, you know, PowerPoint like maybe Crystal did. This is how Indians talk. They kind of go all over the place. So the Blanchette leadership, one of the teachers, they asked us to do a tour. So our youth, and this is a year later, from almost a whole year from when we did the original project. And they our students led that tour, and along with elders and myself and Matt, and it was really neat. It was exciting to see that they remembered and they felt good about being there. And there was a lot of good relationship building. And so that's kind of like some of the work that we do as volunteers in building these really authentic, genuine, lifelong, generational relationships with our community kids. As someone who grew up in Seattle, it means a lot to me to see that, you know, carried on. And I really love it. I love to see the kids getting excited about learning their culture and their traditions and about other, you know, about this land. And that was another thing they did, is they did research and consultation, and they co-created a land acknowledgement also. And but they didn't just jump in and start writing stuff. They researched, they looked at, you know, there's a lot of different variations, you know, in Seattle anyways, around looking at the Coast Salish, Duwamish territory. So those are experiences that they're never going to get, you know, in an institution that continues to shut them out. And I, you know, I have strong opinion, but then there's also there's a lot of facts, as Crystal pointed out. And the reality is that we're really struggling. Our kids are really struggling in the Seattle public schools. And, you know, we have cycled through a whole number of superintendents since I've been involved in this work. And what we're seeing now is a real polarization and a real deadlock in the leadership not working with our community. And when I say our community, it's not just UNEA. I know that they don't work with a lot of tribal people who just don't have maybe the internal resources to ask for help, or know where to go for help, or how to, you know, sign up for Hachusada or Indian Ed, or, you know, 506 forms. And they get lost, you know, they really do. They get lost in the systems. And a lot of times, you know, it's bad results. And so we, you know, we advocate for those voices, and we bring those voices forward, and we share those voices, those stories. And it's really troublesome, you know, that year after year, that's ignored. There's a lot that's ignored. There's a lot of performative and symbolistic gestures, you know, that I see of the Seattle public schools, and not enough within institution advocacy, you know, to make sure that we're getting the resources that we need for our kids to be successful. And UNEA, part of what we're doing is mitigating, you know. I mean, as a community, it's just naturally what we do. We're constantly mitigating the effects, the impact of what's happening in these schools. And it is systemic, and it's not just Indian Ed, you know, it's the whole system. And, you know, they refuse, you know, people talk about decolonization, and it's a fad thing to say, but when you see those structures still being upheld and guarded, they're guarded, you know, those hierarchies and those structures in place, and the people, you know, they're guarding them. And so we, you know, we're up against a lot. And that's, you know, one of the reasons why we do the advocacy, but we also do the direct services, you know. And for me, that's by far rewarding, because that's the connection with our kids. And that means, you know, that's nurturing anyways for me. Yeah, so what I like to use the word or the terms attrition warfare. And that's kind of a harsh term, attrition warfare, but that to me it really does represent what I see happening with a lot of our kids. it's like, if you can't conform and if you can't follow, you know, the normative white middle class norms of that school, then you need to just leave. And our kids they do. A lot of our families that can afford to live in Seattle are affording private school, they're affording moving, they're affording alternatives to that. And it's not because they haven't tried. It's not because, you know, there isn't an effort, you know, to make it work. But it's pretty astounding. And I don't have the data, but I have stories. I have a whole lot of stories of this happening. And not, you know, and I'm not talking like 5 years ago. I'm talking about like in the last couple of years and this year, pre-COVID. And so this is real. This really is. And what I see is that our kids with COVID times, they're not getting those resources, certainly not from the district. They're not getting those resources from very many other kind of mainstream agencies or supports. And it's really been a beautiful thing to see our Native community, small nonprofits join together and working, you know, hand in hand to serve our community to the best ability we can. And that comes in the shape of, you know, like this group can do rent assistance, this group can do medicines, traditional medicines, this group can do, you know, Zoom talk in circles, this group can do outreach. Yeah, it's beautiful. It's just pretty special. And I'm hopeful that energy will keep going, because normally we're not working together as tightly. And so that's been a real strength. And so UNEA, what we've been doing is the students that come to us, or the families that come to us, we do weekly, every week we do a rotation of food deliveries and supplies. Not just supplies, but food. So people will send us a list of what they want. So we're not just like, here's a box of food, you know, oh, you're lactose intolerant. Well, sorry, give that to someone else, you know. And we know, like, as tribal people, there's a lot of dietary issues, and we have multi-generational families, right? We have elders that may have, you know, they need low sodium, or, you know, maybe they have diabetes. And then the lactose thing, you know, that's just a given. But we do that, and we have youth that love helping to you know, go out and deliver. It's good medicine for them too. And they come to the house at 8 a.m. Oh, by the way, we don't have a facility, we don't have a building, we don't have an office. We function out of Sarah's house that I rent. I'm not a homeowner. And it's so, like, we just make it work, you know, because that's what we do as Indian people. We're resourceful as heck. We figure out a way, and we make it happen and pull together and share. You know, that's a real core universal tribal value. And that's what we're doing. And we also have been fortunate to get some grant money to do like school supply stuff and equipment. So desks, chairs, like, they seem like simple things, but they're actually pretty big. You know, headsets, or lights, lamps, things like that, like practical things that people need so that they can actually like study and focus and do the work. And then we also have tutoring twice a week, and that's going really well right now. A lot of students are using that, and we have a lot of great volunteers. And we have our Clear Sky Academy. You can cut me off, Michelle, because, you know, I like to.
I know, because it's, you know what, I can't, like what you were saying a minute ago, like you have a half staff person, a half-time staff person, and then you're saying all these things that you're doing, and it is totally inspirational. So you're right. Let me hear from Victoria a little bit, and then we'll come back to you and a little bit more.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you everyone. I'm happy to be here. So I'd say my community-based work actually started in high school. At the time, my school's Indian Ed director, Gail, she took me on a field trip to visit one of Sarah's events. And meeting in a circle and sharing food. And I think it was a holiday time because there was gifts and you had presents wrapped for giveaway. And so you sent me home with presents. And it felt really good. And I want other students to have that community too. And so over the years, it's been trying to figure out how do we do this? And when we started talking about weaving and other activities, there's always a need for material and like, where do we get it? Like, because people look at me weird if I'm just collecting plants from the sidewalk. And they ask, what are you doing with that? But anyways, over the years, we started Indigenous Roots to increase access to green space and to grow culturally relevant foods and plants. There's 3 owners, Ashley Alvarez, Taylor Ahana, and myself. And the main goal is to increase access to green spaces, growing and harvesting the plants for a variety of uses, and to help facilitate learning in the community around Seattle. And one of my favorite quotes that I love to come back to, it was, don't teach all of our children exactly the same thing. If you teach them everything all the same, they won't need one another and the world will split apart. And I heard that in the Teachings of the Tree People film. And so starting this business, it was a way for us to explore farming and our own personal interests like along the way. And so I focused my time at sharing these farming experiences with youth through workshops in after school and summer programming. And so my interests are really in like growing plants and being outside, making and creating things and sharing stories. So I try to choose activities to fit that school setting, but it still helps us explore our interests. And I work with mostly elementary youth. And so along the way, we definitely find out our dislikes along the way, and they're very vocal about it. Sorry about that, my dog. And how do we relate our culture and learning to everyday life? And these things take practice and repetition. And, at first, I'm sorry about that. When I was a kid, I could always just walk outside when I was hungry. I used to live in Northern California, and we had a big yard where I could just walk outside and there was apples and cherries and blackberries, walnuts and lemons and plums. And there was areas where like we gardened and we had flowers, and it was one of my chores to help maintain that area. But the food plants, they were just always there, and I don't remember having to take care of them. And I could just walk outside when I was hungry. And living in a more urban area now, I realize that it's not that accessible for everyone just to walk outside and there's food. And so I wanted to be a part of that movement where we can make that a normal thing. And it wasn't later until high school and early college when I was learning more about boarding schools and the very intentional separations that were taking place. Because our people, we receive a lot of our guidance from our local environment, and that's an active relationship. So learning about how that's impacted our people, it can feel really overwhelming at times. It affects our health, economy, our family, how we travel, how we communicate. So how do we, move forward through all that? And so thinking about my particular gifts and my roles and responsibilities, I know I'm really good at, reading and absorbing information and helping to teach that to others and patients. And I enjoy planning things and making lists and dancing and running. And so that helps me be able to explore a lot of different topics with the kids because they have their own interests too. You can't do the same type of activity each day. You have to be fluid and, meet the needs of everyone. So the 3 service learning sites I had during college, the peer tutoring evolved to more program development, and it helped demonstrate to me the importance of showing up and consistency and being present. And the health clinic, it helped introduce me to working in the various branches of community services. So elders and veterans, domestic violence, youth, and that client-facing programming. And then with the invasive species removal, it emphasized how plants and animals all have roles in the ecosystem and how that place in our local environment, it really matters. And it plays into our health and our overall wellness. And wellness, it's the active efforts of trying to be healthy. And so I think that's it. Constantly, we're doing that on a daily basis. But it's really it's affected by our shelter, our food, our community network, our exercise. Those are all parts of our health. And so when COVID happened, it definitely forced my work to evolve. But unfortunately, when you're talking about farming and education, none of those topics really changed. It was always still the same focus areas. Those are always going to be essential, growing your food and teaching the youth. And so it helped demonstrate more, not just the orgs I'm working with, but at the city and our federal and global level, that the importance of housing and food to our overall health. And, that's a basic need for everybody. And so working in an after school program, it's shown me, time and time again that students really need good sleep and meals before that they can be in learning mode. And teaching remotely, I've been able to participate, I think, in more events than I would have otherwise been able to. And it made traffic easier when I was driving out to the farm in Carnation. That helped with the commute from Seattle. But last spring, when I was working with the students, when we first started going remote, there was definitely less students attending. And there was various reasons. We have transient families, internet access, device. Not all, if there's multiple students in the family, not everyone has their own device to work with. So that was definitely a challenge last spring. And this fall, I think the schools have made some progress on that, but it's still a need. Like, our families need housing. That's a big one. Yeah, and so with COVID, talking about food and education, we really always need to think about how we're going to take action and invest in our local foods, and that as climate change continues to happen, we need to be prepared for migrations of our people, plant, and animal species, and what that means for growing food locally. And there's been a lot of lessons along the way. Planning it ahead, it helps me feel really rooted and confident in my thoughts. But when you're working with kids, you have to be really flexible and present. And sometimes your lesson plans go out the window, but it helps just to help having thought it out ahead to center yourself. And lots of patience working with kids. They challenge you to meet them where they're at and to be very present, and back to, we need to meet our basic needs before we can be ready to learn. Yeah, and recognizing my limits in this community work. Obviously, Sarah's been in this, did you say 12 years just for UNEA? So it's going to be a marathon and not a sprint. So learning how to prioritize what needs to be done today and what can wait one more day.
Thank you, Victoria. You all have shared just so much powerful information, and I really hope people are just sitting with it, because it's about our future. It's about our community. It's about everyone belonging and having their full role and their full space and their full ability to be who they are culturally, right? Our time is getting a little short, and so I think I'm going to have time to ask each of you one question, and then if there's anything that comes from the audience, I'll weave it in. And so I'm going to start with Crystal, because you did such a beautiful job of weaving the past into the present. And one of the things that we know is that for Native students, the rates of suspension and expulsion are like disproportionately out of whack. And it's not because these kids are bad kids, right, or misbehaving. It is because of the absence of cultural education and a sense of belonging. It's because of all the things that Sarah described, right, of things that kids experience in school that make them like not even want to go, right? And one of the things that you mentioned, Crystal, was this Since Time Immemorial Act. And that act attempting to bring Native education into schools, because that's one of the things that can make it a better experience for Native students, right? So I'd love for you to say a little bit more about it and who is covered by it and what does it mean to kids' educational experience and the ability to sort of, close out this negative loop from the history and bring us into a better present and future.
Yeah, thank you for that question. The Since Time Immemorial Act is about 5 years old now. It has the support of all of the 29 federally recognized tribes, but one of the things that basically what it is that it requires school districts to draw upon the most local, within a certain radius, federally recognized tribes developed curriculum that gives an overview of their history, and in terms of geography, certain values, certain practices, and basically, yeah, just the history of the tribes that are local to that school district that are federally recognized. It doesn't reach beyond federally recognized tribes. So there are many tribes in Washington that don't have federal recognition, and if they do not have federal recognition, then they're not included in the act. So, for example, the Duwamish tribe who lack federal recognition, it's up to the school district in order to include information about the Duwamish tribe. They're not required to by law like they are for other tribes that do have federal recognition. So that is one, I think, limitation of Since Time Immemorial. Another big limitation is that it doesn't have a deadline written into it for implementation. So there isn't any way for OSPI, or the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, to monitor or make sure that this curriculum is in fact being implemented in schools and is in fact being taught by a certain date. They're also, from the work that I've been doing recently with school districts, it's become very clear that there isn't adequate funding for training for teachers to fully teach the curriculum in a way that's respectful, and in a way that isn't just kind of okay, this is a day we're going to be talking about this, and one and done type of thing. It's not being woven into the rest of the pre-approved curriculum. So there's certainly limitations, and I think that in order for Since Time Immemorial to accomplish the goal, as you said, of incorporating Indigenous history into curriculum, which is important not only for Native students but all students, in order to accomplish that, there needs to be, and in my opinion, there needs to be an expansion of what tribal history is included. There needs to be a deadline. There needs to be a monitoring process. I think the act needs a big overhaul in a way that strengthens it, and that adequately puts resources and funding to make sure it's implementing properly.
Thank you for sharing that. So it sounds like there's still a lot more work to be done for that to really have the power that we needed to have. Sarah, you really brilliantly tied it together, how for Indigenous youth to survive and thrive, it's like a whole package. It's the educational piece, right? But it's having food to eat, it's having a place to live, it's all of those things. I wonder if you can talk about, having done this kind of work for so many years, like what's your big dream for Indigenous youth so that they can truly survive and thrive?
Well, what I envision, what I continue to advocate for is for us to have ownership of facility and building where our community, like a real true community center that is a multi-purpose facility, and that would house a K through 12 Native focus education that we design, that we develop, that we create in Seattle. And one of the things about Seattle is that, we are really diverse and we don't always get along. And in fact, a lot of us don't get along, but we can come together when it comes to the kids and when we need to pull together. And that's what matters, and looking at the current education structure of the district, we've been advocating for Indian Heritage High School ever since they closed it in 2013. And we were given the Licton Springs K-8 Native, they turned that into a Native focused school, but now they're relocating it to a very remote location in Ballard, and removing it out of the Robert Eagle staff building. So there's just these reenactments of that trauma, and of that being displaced, being erased, being invisible, not having the leadership listen to our voices, and where is the equity? I hear that a lot. It's a tagline, inclusion, diversity, equity, but when it comes to Native students, we're not seeing that. I don't see it. And so my vision would be for us to have our own facility, our own building, where as a community, we can sort out our differences and really create something special for our kids and for the entire community. So there's a continuum, not just a standalone, high school, but that's wrapped around lots of other, support services as well. And for the kids that want to go to a regular school, great. I went to a regular school, like that's great. But I know I had a whole lot of resources, and cultural support and spiritual support and connections. I felt like I was a little anomaly, to be that successful. But what I see for a lot of our other kids is no, they don't have those same support systems. They just don't. And so why not? Why can't we have that? Where's the land at? Where is some ownership for our community? We don't have it. I think the only ownership in our community is Chief Seattle Club and the health board. They have brick and mortar ownership. Our no other organization has ownership in Seattle. And I think that right there, we can really build community around that. Right now, our community is just all over the place, hanging on by a thread.
That's a really powerful vision. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Sarah, you must be kind of psyched to see Victoria, one of your people who has been through some of the work that you've done. And now here is Victoria doing amazing work with youth in their own right? And so Victoria, I'm turning to you now and saying, here you are as a part of the continuum, like you've had the opportunity to participate in some of these programs and now you're doing it. And I wonder, as you think and talk about health and wellness and education and how all those things tie together, what does that mean for you, and what's some of the vision that you have for health and wellness for Indigenous youth and people? And I also want to say thank you, audience, for bearing with us if we go just a few minutes over so I can get a chance to wrap up and hear from Victoria. Thanks. Go ahead, Victoria.
Yeah, thank you again. Yeah, I've had so many great mentors over the years that have just really helped me through some hard times. Because at first it felt like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm jumping between places and ideas. But over the years, different mentors have helped me see that thread between the different things I've been doing. And so moving into the future, I think my main goals is I want to keep learning more about program development from, a budget side. I want to think about how we can transform our economy to work better for us. Capitalism is not working. And as Sarah mentioned, getting more land in Seattle for our people, I think is going to be essential. And housing for our families needs to be a big focus. And on the green space side of things, I'd like to see a garden at every apartment building and every school. And so I'm going to try to work on that over the next few years.
That's outstanding. I love that so much. And I'm just thinking, okay, I let Sarah and Victoria each share a dream. So Crystal, I asked you about an act. So you get to share a dream real quick and then I'll wrap up.
A dream I've been thinking about recently is more funding for mental health resources instead of law enforcement in school.
That's a good dream, Crystal. Thank you so much. Okay, so we are a little bit over time, only a tiny bit. So thank you so much, Sarah, Victoria, and Crystal, and for bringing information out to an audience that may not know so much about it. And I hope that if people have further questions or thoughts, they'll take a look at the links that have been put in the chat box to learn more about each of the organizations and the work that you all are doing, and to look at Crystal's beautiful blog post about decolonizing Thanksgiving. And so I want to thank everybody for continuing to tune in every month for Flights and Rights. Thank you, Sarah, Victoria, and Crystal, for bringing your wisdom and beauty and cultural knowledge into this space. I want to thank our ACLU team behind the scenes that was making this happen. I want to remind you that you are in the running to get one of these koozies, and I hope that you win. And I also want to thank Gabriel Teodros from KEXP, who's done a great playlist for us, which I think is also in the chat box. Remind you to visit Off the Res Cafe or Talking Cedar Distillery, as long as you can do so safely. We're taking a break in December, so we're not going to have a Flights and Rights in December, but we're looking forward to seeing you in 2021. And from all of us at the ACLU, we are grateful for you. We are grateful for you and your resilience, your solidarity, and for the future of democracy and the belonging of all people. Have a great night. Thank you again for being here.